I'm your fan.
Good.
I read your articles.
Thank you. Thank you.
My favorite.
Yeah, I'm writing a book right now, so hopefully soon.
You're still right, you know.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately still writing. So we got.
Yeah, I asked Joe for PowerPoint last week. He said fine. He set it up. Yeah, we communicated last. Usual suspects here, or what? Wow. And then there was technology. Okay, where's the computer?
It's right there.
Oh, okay.
So who's doing the PowerPoint presentation?
That's Ross.
Ross is the high tech.
How can you?
Most
Although we're going to block the screen.
Advanced and
How can you
well equipped.
describe things like that? I mean, you can't explain that in words. You have to show it on the screen. It's that IFAS.
Oh, right, right.
Really good IFAS.
Oh, right, right.
Do you want to use your own?
I'm not, this is not PowerPoint. This is just my talk. I'm saving trees.
And you have yours on.
I just like, oh, that's my dog.
That's enough.
He supports the Orange Revolution. Have you seen Ross?
Oh.
I'm biasing my dog.
What order do we want to go in?
I should not be first. That's all.
Should we go out?
Because you're dealing with Russia foreign policy, you should be last then. I'm not trying to make you go last, but you're dealing with foreign issues.
Okay, I'm easy.
Okay,
I don't mind. I've
you
got
have
like
preferences,
graphs and charts
order?
and stuff.
Who's going first?
I have preferences.
What's your preference?
I'd be happy to go somewhere in the middle.
Taras, do you want to start?
Nobody wants to go first.
I think you go first.
Okay,
Okay,
so
I'll go first.
Taras, Adrian, Nicola, Lucan. Then we really do need to have
10
it set up.
minutes. 10 minutes each.
And you're serious? 20 minutes each, right? That's what on the invite was 20 minutes each.
Was it? Okay.
No, I don't mind. I mean,
No, I
That's
mean,
80 minutes. That'll
that's-
be the end of the
Maybe we should do a little shorter.
15 minutes.
let's try 15 minutes.
Mine's gonna be relatively short.
Это бардак и конец, да?
Do it like hockey, 3 periods, and then you're done.
Right. Okay.
Well, I have some coming attractions, so I will speak. Life was a lot easier about 15 years ago when no one had any computers, and I don't know if it's a sign of technological backwardness or not, but our guest from Kiev doesn't seem to have a computer that I can tell, and I don't. So, but everyone else has entered the nano age. Or
I have.
you do?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so. So we can have a 21st century seminar now. A couple of upcoming events. Our next event will be Friday at 3:30, which will be followed by a reception at 5:30. Georgy Derlugian, who's a sociologist at Northwestern, will be speaking on the tenacity of machine politics in old Chicago and new Russia.
This one?
On Monday, February 6th, Mark Garcelon, who's a former Kennan scholar and a sociologist, again, at Middlebury, will be speaking on the myth of democratic power, politics in Russia from perestroika to Putin. We have a couple of Ukraine events scheduled on Valentine's Day. Marta Ditsik, who's here as a Wilson Fellow from Western Ontario, Elizabeta Altroska from CBC and Natalia Petrova, who's a Kennan scholar, who's a specialist on media, will be speaking on media in Ukraine. And on Tuesday, February the 21st at noon, Joseph Harahan, who's a senior scholar at the Defense Department, who's a fellow here this year, is going to be reviewing the history of the program to eliminate nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And it's a really interesting project. And I gather the last strategic bomber was destroyed this week. So Ukraine has now totally eliminated its nuclear weapons system. I also want to announce, there's an announcement outside, but we are very pleased that we will be cooperating with the Harriman Institute of Columbia and with the University of Alberta in co-sponsoring two events, one in New York on April 25th and one here on April 26th, marking the 20th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear accident. And there's a brochure outside. We have a number of very distinguished speakers, including the new ambassador of Ukraine to the United States, and a number of other speakers as well. I think we're getting close, so let me quickly introduce the speakers. I'm going to give truncated introductions as we have 4 speakers, and then we'll see what order we're going in by whether or not the PowerPoint is working. Adrian Karatnycky is counselor and senior scholar at Freedom House. He served previously as executive director and as president of that organization. He was previously assistant to the president of the AFL-CIO and supervised programs which were lending assistance to Solidarnost, among many other activities, and he is a product of Columbia University. Taras Kuzio completed his undergraduate work at the University of Sussex, his master's at the University of London, and his PhD from Birmingham. He's professor at the Elliott School over at GW. Taras is published everywhere. He has far too many books and innumerable articles. I think everybody knows Taras. He has been also a resident fellow at Toronto, at Birmingham, and at Yale. Mykola Rabchuk is a former Kennan scholar. Welcome back. He's a graduate from Lviv Polytechnic Institute and then went on to complete his graduate education at the Gorky Institute of World Literature in Moscow. He, too, is a voracious writer and publisher, and as you know from his many writings, he's a trenchant observer and commentator on contemporary Ukraine. And Lucan teaches political science at Temple University, and he's presently a fellow at the Kellogg Institute. He focuses on post-Cold War regime development, in particular Belarus, Moldova, Russia, and Ukraine. He was educated at Harvard and then went to the University of California, Berkeley for his graduate training. And I think we're now up and running, and the order will be Taras, Adrian, Mykola, and Lucan. Floor is yours if it's working.
Okay, it is, yeah. And we only have 15 minutes each, and I'm sure we need to sort of rush along, as it were. Thank you for inviting me today. I don't like to use usually PowerPoints in very short presentations, but I've got a lot of graphs of projections of seat numbers in the next Parliament based on opinion polls and changes of fortunes of leaders, and I think that that's important to show in graphical form as opposed to me just sort of talking numbers in a talk. But this is just some background about the next elections, how they're going to be very different from earlier elections in 1998 and 2002, first fully proportional elections in Ukraine to both parliament and local councils. Quite a low threshold by European standards. Usually it's around average of 5%. In some regimes like Russia and Georgia, it's 7%, which is probably too high. Parliament's longer than usual. And an important change is that deputies, thankfully, will no longer be able to change factions. So the parliament we elect in March is a parliament that will be there for 5 years, in effect, the same factions. I think that makes it kind of interesting. It's also, let's remember that under Kuchma, there was never a free and fair election. So this is potentially going to be the first free and fair election since '94. And most of the fraud that took place in parliamentary elections earlier was in the majoritarian half of the 98-2002 election, where usually pro-Kuchma officials and businessmen were elected. That's where there was the biggest abuse of state administrative resources, what Americans would call machine politics. So I think that is an important step forward for Ukraine. The last point, Yushchenko's just released a week ago a call for different political parties in the elections to sign a memorandum. So far there's been quite a lot of negativity about it, and most of the major political parties have refused to sign it. Why? Could be a separate question. Okay, let's get to the meat and bones of the issue, as it were. How the situation has changed dramatically from September. Right up until August, Yushchenko and Tymoshenko were in very high figures because of the positive fallout of the Orange Revolution. But things begin to change in a dramatic way against the Orange camp in September, and a number of factors here. You can see that if they were around the same, different opinion polls have different figures, but there wasn't that much difference in the ratings of particularly our Ukraine and regions of Ukraine up until September. What happens from then is that regions of Ukraine springs up to about 30% today, compared to a decline in fortune of our Ukraine and Yulia Tymoshenko bloc. The communists are way, way down, 4 or 5%, compared to 20% in 2002. And I think the same reason as in the 2004 elections, something up to about 3/4 of the communist vote. That's when you're still alive. I mean, remember the average age of the communists is about 70. The ones who are still alive anyway have gone over to regions of Ukraine. So a big change in Ukrainian politics today is that if in the 1990s the pro-Russian force in Ukrainian politics were the communists, today it's regions of Ukraine. And look at the disappointment in political leaders. Tremendous disappointment in Yushchenko since the September crisis, which removed the Tymoshenko government, divided the Orange camp, and also led to the signing of the memorandum with Viktor Yanukovych. And these 3 points, I think, are my analysis of why there has been that growth in disappointment in the Yushchenko camp, or in Yushchenko personally. Besides the division of the camp, the memorandum, we also have non-fulfillment of some of the objectives of the Orange Revolution, particularly bandits to prison and reprivatization. We tend to sort of ignore the fact that the Orange Revolution wasn't just a campaign against election fraud and in favor of democratic rights. There was also many other factors at work there: hostility to corruption, anger about what happened in the 1990s, and the slogan, even of Viktor Yushchenko's himself, of bandits to prison. But what it's going to be like is going to be bandits to parliament. If you take a look at the regions of Ukraine list, it's a rogues gallery of people who we would have thought might have gone to prison last year. Right, these are some slides I've inserted from an IFES, International Foundation for Electoral Systems, poll that was just released, and I was involved in releasing the results a couple of weeks ago. And you can see how things have changed between their survey in February and the survey today. The degree to which the big decline in the numbers of Ukrainians who feel as though Ukraine's not on the right track. Of course, we can put some of this to blame on the fact that any revolution, including the Orange Revolution, is going to lead to very high and unfulfillable expectations. That's undoubtedly the true. But this goes far, far beyond that. Look at this. Is also from the IFES poll. I think a fascinating look at how Yushchenko and Yanukovych voters see the future of Ukraine in terms of stability and stability, and how even amongst Yushchenko voters in November 2005, a great number have gone away from the stability side. It's declined from 68 to 36%. And you've got a huge number of green here. This green column of 38% don't knows. Yushchenko supporters who are disillusioned, who don't want to say that things are going bad, but are a bit unwilling to commit themselves at the moment. And this is, I think, a good way that IFES has done, is dividing the population up into these groups. In the February survey, they had 3 groups: revolutionary enthusiasts, revolutionary opponents, they're pretty obvious as to who they are, and revolutionary agnostics. The people who, I suppose, in the old Ukrainian saying, would have previously said prior to the Orange Revolution, "Moya chata z kraju," I'm not getting involved, but who did in the Orange Revolution come on the streets, who previously would have said, politics is not for me, but they changed their view in the Orange Revolution. In the November survey, they changed it to 4 groups. Committed opponents, committed enthusiasts, but a new group, they've included dissatisfied supporters. And you can see how many of them are, 24%, a very large number of disillusioned Orange voters. Now, this is one of the areas I picked out from the survey where they, one of the reasons for the disappointments, the fact that, and maybe this is far too high, far too kind of romantic a view of if people really think that officials are going to suddenly change in their attitudes to the public after the Orange Revolution. I mean, it's the same officials today after the Orange Revolution who were there prior to the Orange Revolution, except for 17,000 who allegedly have been removed by Yushchenko government. But you can see that, that there's been a view that the officials haven't really changed in their responsiveness to the public. I think I've already done that one. But let's go to the actual looking at the different political parties and blocs. I don't think it's any example of progress of democracy in Ukraine that this year we're going to have 45 parties and blocs campaigning as opposed to 33 4 years ago. Especially as only 6 to 8 will enter the next parliament. But many of them are there not for parliament, but to get into local councils, where they, can have influence on business or local politics. This is where I talked with Lucan and Gino Fischel over lunch. This is where it's really confusing to try and analyze Ukrainian politics. On the one hand, the largest faction in the next parliament, based on polling results in September, are going to be regions of Ukraine. At the same time, the leaders in Ukraine with the lowest levels of public trust, including a negative rating, are Yanukovych, Kravchuk, Medvedchuk, and Semenenko. So that shows that regions of Ukraine voters don't like Yanukovych, in effect, but they're going to vote for him anyway. The highest levels of trust, all in the 30s, are these individuals, including still Yushchenko, Tymoshenko. So what is the reason for that? I have 2 suggestions here, maybe. That for Eastern Ukrainian voters, Yanukovych's past criminality and the fact that he has oligarchs on his list. If you haven't anybody seen Channel 5, the Regions of Ukraine election broadcast has 5 leading figures on the election broadcast, including Akhmetov. They're not hiding the fact that Ukraine's most wealthy oligarch is in one of the leading members of Regions of Ukraine list. First time he's going to parliament. So the issue of past criminality of Yanukovych, the issue of the fact that oligarchs are in the Regions of Ukraine list is obviously not an issue for East Ukrainian voters, whereas it is for Western and Central Ukrainian voters. Maybe I think Mykola Rabchuk might have something to say about this issue of regional political culture. And I think there's also still a lot of negative voting taking place. The Regions of Ukraine voters might not like Yanukovych, but they're voting against Yushchenko. As they did, as many people did, by the way, on both sides in the Orange Revolution, against Yanukovych and against Yushchenko. I've divided the six political forces which are most definitely likely to cross the 3% threshold. 3 biggest and 3 smallest. These are the 3 biggest. They're pretty obvious what they are. At the moment, it seems Regions of Ukraine will come first. The big question is who will come second, our Ukraine or Tymoshenko bloc. And the 3 smaller ones, again, no-brainer, Socialist, Communist, and Litvin bloc, all with around 5–6%. Let's look at the breakdown ideologically. And the parties in red here are ones close to the 3% threshold. I think today's opinion poll I saw, which I included, Pura reforms and order getting very close to the 3% threshold. So if you're a disappointed Yushchenko voter, you could potentially not go to Tymoshenko, but go to Pura reforms and order. But of course, then you've got the Vitrenko. There are ladies present. I can't say what I think of her, but and then you've got the Medvedchuk-Netak bloc, which I think they won't get in. But those are the sort of that would be the left, center, right divide in Ukrainian politics. Just looking at the 6 in black, what's interesting to see is that 3 of those 6 are completely ideologically empty political forces. Litvin bloc, regions of Ukraine, and Tymoshenko. They have absolutely no ideology there at all. Regional divisions are still strong. This is from a Kiev International Institute of Sociology poll in December. Look at how Ukraine is still divided in terms of region. And here and this is Dominic Karel's done, he's added up pro-orange forces like the socialists, Tymoshenko, Yushchenko, Poles, and then the anti-orange forces would be the communists and regions of Ukraine. And you can see how Ukraine is incredibly still divided in that breakdown. There hasn't been any progress in overcoming those regional divisions, which were deliberately exacerbated during the 2004 elections. How does this change into seats? Well, this is on one particular poll. I have another poll I'll show you as well. You can see how regions of Ukraine on this particular poll, and the figures are now higher, the new poll, will get the largest faction in parliament. Now, nothing in the constitution reforms says that the faction with the largest number of deputies has a right morally to establish the government and launch a parliamentary coalition and then create a government. There's nothing in the constitution reform that says that. But of course, the faction with the largest number of deputies is going to say that we have a right to do that. Now, the counter-argument would be that in 2002, Yushchenko said that, and he was denied it with Our Ukraine, which came first. But certainly, that could be a problem. Of course, this is a new poll, a more recent poll by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology. And if you can see on the sort of the left-hand side, ignore the 3 right-hand columns at the moment, but on the right-hand side, you've got regions of Ukraine coming up now up to close to 40%. What this is that the problem with opinion polls we read sometimes about is that they give an opinion poll of what people would vote. This gives more the voting count of those who are going to vote. So the figures actually go up for all of the different blocks. And then the next 2 columns on the left would be, of course, Tymoshenko and Yushchenko. The 3 right-hand columns would be, as you see in that graph, if you have regions of Ukraine and Communist Party, would be the green, the orange coalition, and then the orange and Litvin. So it could lead, or it would lead, to a very divisive, essentially heavily divided parliament. In terms of if the orange coalition comes back together, then these 2 left-hand columns would be, the first column would be the Tymoshenko, Yushchenko socialists, the second column would be those 3 plus Litvin, and of course the opposition would be the communists and regions of Ukraine. What kind of coalitions are we talking about potentially? I've broken it down into potentially 3 scenarios. For many of us, maybe the orange coalition would be the best. This would be the usual suspects, as it were. The problem with Litvin would be that the conflict is with the Socialist Party, as they are really campaigning in the same areas of rural central Ukraine for voters. What about Kuchma Light? It's not out of the question, not something I'm saying I would support, but regions of Ukraine and Our Ukraine. After all, although the Yushchenko camp today complain about Tymoshenko voting against the government together with regions of Ukraine, at the same time, Yushchenko himself in late September signed a memorandum with Yanukovych. And then the least likely is Kuchma Hard. But you know, again, I go back to this question, who has the moral right, or who has the right to create a parliamentary coalition? Is it regions of Ukraine who come first? Then anything's game. And of course, Litvin, being the typical Ukrainian, in the Ukrainian phraseology, ne ryba, ne miasto, will go, I think, with anybody. Right?
He's the smartest guy.
This will be a breakdown of those three scenarios with who would then be in opposition. Again, Kuchma-like, Kuchma-hard, and the opposition. For some political blocs like Litvin, I'm sure it would be very difficult, and they wouldn't want to be defined as either pro-government or pro-opposition. There's a very strong reluctance. But with a new setup, you have to, I think, choose where you're going to be. Of course, the big question mark is, and this is where Yushchenko could be, if there's no agreement with Tymoshenko, where he could be forced, or he could then go, to hell with you, I'm going to go over to regions of Ukraine, creating Kuchma Light. And the big question mark is who's going to be prime minister. Unofficially, at least, what we hear is that whoever comes first between Tymoshenko and Yushchenko, which at the moment looks who's going to come second or third, then they have a right to propose their candidate for prime minister. And remember, this will be a prime minister who will have far greater power. So, of course, Tymoshenko's hoping that she'll come in second. Opinion polls tell us different things. Some give Tymoshenko coming ahead of our Ukraine. Some give our Ukraine coming ahead of Tymoshenko. And the choice is, I think, pretty simple: Yekhanurov or Tymoshenko there. What happens if it's Kuchma Light? Yanukovych back as prime minister? Would he agree to such a coalition without something in return? He's himself talked about Akhmetov as a potential prime minister and even as a presidential candidate. The results on domestic politics, I think, are pretty clear. If it's Kuchma Light, if it's a coalition with Yanukovych, then it's back to the good old days. So I think that those policies we're all pretty clear about. So the stakes are extremely high. Sadly, at least from my point of view, I don't seem to get the impression from reading interviews with President Yushchenko that he understands that. But let's go on to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Taras. Adrian?
Is it okay if I speak from here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Good afternoon. I have to say that in November, Taras, Kuzio, and I were part of a panel, and I think, although we will say a few different things because the campaign has developed, fundamentally we're not going to say that many different things. And that is precisely because of my basic fundamental point about the upcoming Ukrainian election, and that is that the society is very firmly divided into two camps that will not cross over to vote for the other. And one camp, broadly speaking, is a camp that looks upon the Orange Revolution with all of the inadequacies of its implementation as a positive event and does not trust Yanukovych, and the other, which views with hostility the Orange Revolution and trusts neither Yulia Tymoshenko nor Viktor Yushchenko. I think that if you look at the recent polling data from mid-January from the Razumkov Center, it reflects that general trend. When asked which politicians do you support in whole or in part, Yushchenko gets a comfortable, in terms of electoral politics, a comfortable 52% level of support, and 42% say we do not view him as a politician we can support. With Yanukovych, it's almost the mirror image. It's about 42% that support him in full or in part, and 52% that say we cannot support him. We cannot support him as a politician. That divide, which roughly translates to the 52 to 44 divide that existed during the parliamentary, the last presidential election, is a mirror image of the way Ukraine was right after the Orange Revolution. The one thing that can be said, which is a great setback for the Orange forces, is that the lack of performance in many areas and the internal divisions within the Orange camp has prevented them from making regional gains and from developing a base, a more substantial base in the south and some base in the east. So if you look at what has happened between if you looked at where Ukraine was in May, if you had had an election, the orange camp would have won over 70% of the seats, and the anti-orange camp a little under 30%. If you looked in August, it was 60-40, but now it's 55-45, and that's pretty much the way it has been since Yushchenko removed Yulia Tymoshenko. So what we really have now is, within the anti-orange camp, the consolidation of support around the Party of Regions, partly, I think, because of its strong regional base, partly because it has, I think, waged even a pre-electoral campaign of some competence, but also a collapse of other alternatives. So there is a consolidation and very high ratings, but there is no other major force. And if you look at the competition today, if you projected the latest Razumkov poll, it would show that with Litvin, the orange camp, or that majority, would be a fixed 56-44, fixed 56.5 to 43.5 majority in terms of parliamentary seats. Again, roughly close to the 52-44 majority by which Yushchenko won. And between November and January, the poll shows that the Yushchenko-Tymoshenko groups together gained 6.6% increase in their in their support. The Litvin socialist groupings gained 3.6, so about 10.2 for that kind of a coalition, while almost all of the gains of 10%, 10.5% that occurred in the anti-orange camp were in the popularity of the regions, while the Communist Party has slightly declined and the Progressive Socialist Party is kind of meandering on the threshold. So that being said, we still have 2 months of an electoral campaign to be waged, but and of course the dynamics could still be affected by some dramatic real-world events or some dramatic new electoral technologies that might influence a small portion of voters. But I think that we can comfortably say that on the basis of the evidence, there is a kind of a threshold to which the camp that would want to reverse and return to an old style of governance, how much support there is for that type of grouping in the political spectrum. Let's talk a little bit about the business interests. We had a series of what were called political financial parties that were very dominant in the past parliaments, political financial groups. That influence as specific political financial groups is somewhat declining, but it is actually, the reverse is occurring. Businessmen of large and middle enterprises are proliferating throughout the lists of most political parties. It is not just the Regions Party that has large numbers of business leaders, oligarchs, minigarchs, and what have you. The Socialist Party list has a considerable number of these representatives of the business elite, as is the Tymoshenko bloc. Statistically, in 1998, when there was the first great move of business interests into the parliament, 14% of all candidates were from the business circles. In 2002, it was 21%, and today it is 28%, a 100% increase. This is going to be a heavily rich, heavily business-interested parliament. And I don't think that that is necessarily bad. And I don't think that it is, I believe that when I talk a little bit about the dynamics of what may be going on in the Regions Party, I think it's also an important phenomenon that I think is moving that party into a Western orientation and Western direction. Let's talk a little bit about, apart from the lists, let's talk a little bit about the electoral platforms. If you choose to go onto the websites of the main political parties that are contesting the election, and I think I have not looked at the Communist Party platform, but I just assume that it is a predictable repetition of their policies. But I think it would be wrong if you believe in the party platform of the Regions to say that this is not an ideological party. This is a party that wants to end all taxation for small business, all taxes on small business. It wants to drastically reduce taxes on middle-sized business, and it wants to reduce the tax burden for big businesses. It is for a return of more power to the regions, hence the name, which I think it reflects the party's understanding that it may not be able to shape the next majority, but it wants to be able to shape power in its backyard and to exercise patronage through local governance. It is the Regions Party, as is now the Socialist Party, as is now certainly the Tymoshenko bloc, the Yushchenko bloc, and all are for European integration. All are for the choice, the option of the European Union. There is no sort of hesitancy now about expressing this. The only nuance in the Regions Party's platform is that it hopes that this move into Europe and into Western European institutions can be done with Russia coming in as well. That's the only nuance which suggests some favorable relationship with Russia in the entire platform. Secondly, the party positions itself as a party that is willing to work with work in coalition with parties of a democratic and of a patriotic, or I would interpret national democratic orientation. So it is signaling what Taras was saying, that it may be interested in that kind of a coalition. And the final point is the role of Mr. Akhmetov and the role of business interests. It's not just Akhmetov, it's the head of Motor Sich, the major auto manufacturing entity, the automotives entity, that are among the leaders in this bloc. And if you look at the investment orientation of Mr. Akhmetov, he is moving his investments to places like Turkey. He is moving his investments to places like Italy. If you look at the Ukrainian oligarchic and industrial elite, they are not investing in Russia. They are not engaging in joint ventures with Russia. They're investing in a broader European environment. That is where they see their profits. That is where they see their the eventual integration of the country. And that suggests to me is part of the good news of this important player, which I don't believe will be in the ruling coalition, but which could theoretically lend its support to maintain some stability on key votes. And if I were characterizing this program of tax reductions, I would say that it is a liberal program. Now, we know that they are also looking for particular tax havens and special favors and rent seeking and so forth. So the problem with the Regions Party is not the ideology that it is putting forward. It's also very interesting that it is now speaking in this new category in a much clearer way than Yanukovych spoke about these paths previously. So I think there is a sort of a shift of attention and interest on the part of the financial and business interests within that party. When Mr. Yanukovych gave his famous interview 2.5 weeks ago, touting Renat Akhmetov as an upcoming political leader, potential president, potential prime minister, he was not signaling that Akhmetov is about to become Ukraine's Berlusconi. He was signaling, however, who is in charge of that party, what are the driving forces. The driving forces in the Regions Party are not Mr. Yanukovych, they are not Russia, they are not a pro-Russian orientation. They are this new, empowered, rich business elite, which is happy to work with Mr. Yanukovych because he has what they don't have, name recognition, and the polling shows it. So let's leave it at that. When we look at the other platforms, I think we can say that the Our Ukraine platform is a relatively predictable platform. It is generally supportive of the main course of the policies of the Ukrainian government over the last several months, and more broadly, it sees some continuity even in terms of many of the accomplishments of the is taking credit for the accomplishments of the entire Orange government under Yulia Tymoshenko. It clearly has it also is reemphasizing Euro integration themes. It is emphasizing its connection with Viktor Yushchenko and using his lower but still substantial support as part of its electoral appeal. And Yulia Tymoshenko, I think, is harder to politically characterize. She is more of a populist, nationalist populist in her platform and in her presentations. Her speech at the organizing congress of her bloc was issued all sorts of calls for I would say normal populist campaign promises, including making good on banking losses of people who had suffered losses with the collapse of the Soviet banking system, carving up the Krivorizhstal premium in a variety of ways, none of which were to secure some resources for a reserve that might help Ukraine survive the coming increases in energy prices. In any event, my general prognosis from what has been said, what are the trends and what are the sort of internal developments within these parties is generally optimistic, except in one regard, and that is that the failure, as Taras said, of the prosecution of the successful prosecution, not the failure of the investigation of cases, not the failure of the initiation of cases, not the failure of transferring the data and the information to the prosecutorial entities, but the failure of the prosecutorial entities to move forward with the prosecutions of people who perpetrated the voter fraud, who were responsible for the deaths of journalists, for the harassment of political opponents, for the people who were responsible for most significantly for the electoral fraud, has left a number of as Taras's presentation has indicated, a number of people against whom there are criminal investigations and criminal charges very high up and prominent on the Regions Party list. And that is, I think, the greatest threat. The Regions Party and the stability of Ukraine would have been immensely helped if that kind of a process had occurred. The Regions Party would then have the potential, and I believe it still does have the potential, if it purges itself with the help of criminal prosecutorial entities and with some internal process of its own, if it purges itself from some of its criminal and authoritarian elements. That said, I would still say that today what we're talking about is the potential to create a not very stable majority, but a reasonably comfortable pro-orange majority. And the competition is really for the leadership in this, because Yulia Tymoshenko really believes that if her party receives the largest number of seats within the Orange Bloc or the expanded Orange Bloc, that she should be given the right to serve as prime minister. And the current polling seems to show that since her vote, just as Yushchenko's popularity and Our Ukraine's popularity suffered when he initiated a move against the unity and voted against a government of Yulia Tymoshenko and sought or received the support of the Regions Bloc in bringing Mr. Yekhanurov to power, so too did Yulia Tymoshenko suffer, and her party's support has declined in the weeks since she joined in a coalition against the Yekhanurov government and in coalition with Yanukovych. Now, I don't disagree with Taras's scenarios. I think they are all potential scenarios, but I think the most realistic ones are either a technocratic government that would be led by someone with some association. It'll either be an Orange Bloc with Our Ukraine in the majority, which means that Yulia Tymoshenko will not be the prime minister of an orange-led majority, or there will be a minority government with some understanding and arrangements with the regional bloc, so that the regional bloc would vote as it did before in support of a government that is proposed by the Yushchenko and Our Ukraine forces. The most important fact within the future of Ukraine, however, needs to be elucidated, and that is the consequences of the constitutional reforms. I think it is important to bear in mind, I think it is wrong a prime minister under the current emerging constitutional system could be a very powerful force if that prime minister commanded a very large bloc within or had an absolute majority. Given the discipline mechanisms within the factions, any party that attained a majority and a prime minister who was the leader of that party would have really very extensive powers. But those scenarios are not likely in this election, and they're probably, given the hangover of the regional divisions within Ukraine, are not likely to be a part of the scene in this government, or probably the next government, whether that election occurs in 4 years or in a couple years' time, or even sooner than that. And in this system, it seems to me that the prime minister is actually potentially going to be weaker than the prime minister is today. And the reason I say that is because, number one, the parliament has the right to remove by majority vote at any time, at its will, any ministers for non-performance. Secondly, if that prime minister does not have a stable majority, there is a very and it is a small majority, it is a possibility of a rapid collapse of the governing coalition. In that kind of a circumstance, I do think there are some ambiguities about where presidential power is. And presidential power will be determined partly by the rulings of the next Constitutional Court, not in the sense of revising the Constitution, but just interpreting what are the powers. One of the powers in the Constitution that is given to the president is the ability to block legislation when it is considered to be in contravention of the Constitution. Not to make a decision that is unconstitutional, but he is given the right of being at least a temporary constitutional guarantor. And then presumably this is supposed to be given to the Supreme Court to rule whether in fact there is something like this. And it remains to be seen whether the courts will rule in this more broadly, whether a budget that is out of whack or unbalanced might be perceived as part of the president's constitutional responsibilities to protect the country's stability and security, and whether a future court might rule that that is within those powers. So I don't think that the issues of the limitations of the powers of the president are completely defined, and I think that the really interesting game will be how the courts in the coming years rule on those issues as well. And given the fact that we are likely to have either rather uncomfortable and not particularly stable coalitions, ruling coalitions, it may turn out that the judicial system will find some interpretations that would support that kind of an evolution of constitutional precedent. So on that, I'll conclude. Again, just to reiterate my basic points, that is that I believe that there is a stable anti-Yanukovych and stable anti-Orange or anti-Yushchenko fragmentation of the Ukrainian political spectrum, and that this is too soon to those recent and important and kind of psychologically important events for these blocs and voters to cross. There is more fragmentation on the Orange bloc, but there is fully the possibility of the Orange bloc recombining and forming a ruling majority. I think my general prognosis is that I think it is unlikely that Mr. Yanukovych will be prime minister, and I think it is unlikely that Yulia Tymoshenko will be prime minister. I don't necessarily predict that Mr. Yakhanurov will be prime minister, but it would either be Mr. Yakhanurov or some kind of a compromise candidate, but generally proposed from out of the Orange orbit, generally proposed, I would argue, from the Our Ukraine orbit.
Good. Where's yours? Okay.
Let me start with a few minor references to the statements of my colleagues. First of all, I don't think that minority government can emerge because constitution, a new version of constitution stipulates that no such a government could be created. First of all, majority should be created in the parliament. So,
speak a little bit closer to the microphone.
all right.
If you can.
Second, also, I do not predict often collapses of the government in the future Ukraine. Just because such collapses would entail new elections, and elections in Ukraine are very expensive. They are financed by the shadow schemes and so on. So probably the governments and the majority in the parliament, coalitions in the parliament would be rather stable. Also, I don't think that Akhmetov would run any time for presidency, just because he hasn't begun to learn Ukrainian yet. And I believe that there is a sort of consensus among the Ukrainian elites about the need to have some command of Ukrainian, at least for ritualistic purposes. And finally, I don't think that Lithuanian is neither fish nor meat. Basically, I believe that he is the smartest Ukrainian politician. He has successfully made his career from great cardinal, and he successfully realized his rather limited skills. He managed to silence very negative image he had after the Melnichenko's tapes were revealed, and his role in Gongadze affair is well known. He managed to silence this issue, and also he's very successfully silenced his plagiarism. Moreover, he persuaded some very reputable people like Igor Yukhnovsky to support his candidacy in the Academy of Sciences, and he became academic in Ukraine, largely because of support of Yukhnovsky and National Democratic Camp. I'm afraid that we rather underestimate this politician, and from my point of view, he's the most dangerous of them, because all the other contribute something new to Ukrainian politics, either Yushchenko, Tymoshenko, or even Yanukovych, maybe in negative terms, but he contributes something new, while Lithuanian is a successor, a direct continuation of old Soviet politics. He could be labeled as a spiritual son of Mr. Kravchuk, probably not Kuchma, but rather Kravchuk. It's the same type of apparatchik. But anyway, I believe that all these differences between Ukrainian politicians are rather insignificant, or of little significance, because basically all of them belong to the same generation, and this generation could be defined as a Komsomol generation. What occurred in Ukraine within 20 years, and 20 years passed since perestroika began and the rotation of old communist elite began, would be called as a change of communist nomenclatura for Komsomol nomenclatura. I don't mean the career peculiarities of new elite, but rather their mentality. And their mentality, either Yanukovych's or Yushchenko's or Tymoshenko's, is primarily Komsomol mentality. So I predict that 20 more years are needed before the new generation emerged and came in power, and probably after that we would have more or less normal country. So I'm rather optimistic. Well, basically, I believe that Ukrainians again have the government they deserve. They didn't have this government within 10 years, actually within 5 years, because in the 1990s they had the government they deserved. Nobody can deny that elections in 1991 or in 1994 were more or less free and fair. Both Kravchuk and Kuchma #1 were elected fairly. Those governments reflected the levels, the civility, the political culture of Ukrainian society. Actually, the troubles began in 1999 when Kuchma decided to run for the second term, having virtually zero rating, zero support, zero popularity. And it was his major mistake. It was a fatal mistake and very dramatic or even tragic for the entire country, because in order to win those elections, to be re-elected again, he had to violate all possible rules and laws and so on. And this actually prevented connection between the society and the ruling elites, between the two connected vessels. Because basically, any nation has a government it deserves, as long as there are free elections, as there are more or less free mass media, independent court system, and so on. Ukraine had these things more or less in the 1990s, but this connection between the two vessels, between the elite and the population at large, was blocked in 1999 when Ukrainians didn't have actually the choice. They were manipulated. And they had to make artificial choice between bad and worse. Now, after the revolution, this connection was reestablished, and I believe that Ukraine would develop more or less gradually and evolutionary in the nearest future. Any coalition, of course, may emerge after the elections. However, I predict that Yanukovych's ratings are rather high. They are higher than they are in actuality, probably because all these opinion polls reflect people's dissatisfaction, and this is verbal dissatisfaction. So people react to the opinions polls, and they know that these are just opinion polls. So they express their anxiety, but this is verbal dissatisfaction. It doesn't mean that this dissatisfaction would be converted into real into deeds. Because electoral vote is different from the opinion surveys, and it's more responsible. So people cannot just express their dissatisfaction in this verbal way, because it would have much more serious consequences. So I predict that results would be a bit different, but still any coalition may emerge. So far, if you look at these groups of electorate. Perfectly presented here by Taras Kuzio, we would see that actually the two major groups, actually all the three groups didn't change. We have more or less one third of the Sovietophile electorate. We have 1/3 of Ukrainophile electorate, strongly committed to some ideas, ideologies, and we have 1/3 of so-called Boloto people, undecided. Of course, within the last decade, since early 90s till 2002 and especially 2004, some very significant changes occurred within these groups of electorate. First of all, we can notice the redistribution of electorate within the Sovietophile bloc, shift from the communist to the non-communist Sovietophiles, primarily Party of Regions, head by Yanukovych. We can notice different changes within the National Democratic, within the Ukrainophile, within the Orange group, and we can see that the third group, the group of undecided, gradually, very gradually, shifted into the orange part of the spectrum. It's very slight, very moderate shift, but still it can be noticed, and probably this resulted in substantial changes in the results of parliamentary vote in 2002 and in presidential vote in 2004. I have a couple of maps here which cannot be cannot be seen from the back rows, but nonetheless, you know this maps because they show how Ukraine is divided electorally and linguistically and ethnically, and these lines they coincide. These regions more or less coincide, but why? But I'd like to draw your attention to another very important fact, that this line between the orange and blue Ukraine, so to say, roughly coincides with the line of the old borders of Rzeczpospolita, of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. If you look at the furthest reach of Polish-Lithuanian state, the first Rzeczpospolita, you would find that it roughly coincides with this line from north to Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv. This is very important observation from my point of view, because it shows that political culture does matter. Of course, people who live on those territories in central Ukraine, not in western Ukraine, because of course it's different. It has not been Sovietized, and people there still have a sort of memory about non-Soviet times. In central UK, they don't have this memory, but nonetheless, I feel that a different sort of civilization developed there historically, and within 10 years, this civilization was somehow revitalized. And so the important shift which occurred in the electoral preferences within the last decade not incidentally occurred primarily and particularly on those territories where Rzeczpospolita existed long ago, and didn't occur in the territories which never belonged to any other country except Russia, except Moscow. So the problem again emerges whether these southeastern territories could ever become different in political terms. I don't say about ethnic or cultural or linguistic. That's another problem. But could they be politically different? That's very interesting question, very problematic. So far, we can see rather deterioration of both ethnical and cultural and linguistic situations there, and political as well. Donbass, I mean Luhansk and Donetsk region and Crimea are the only three regions of Ukraine where the number of Ukrainians declined within the last decade between the two censuses. The number of Ukrainophones declined within the last two censuses, 1989 and 2001. And probably these regions would be the most problematic because the clear rejection of any westernized sort of ideology emerges there, ideology which is perceived there as a nationalistic, as a Galician, and so on. Probably those regions would be the most would be the bastions of Sovietophiles, but still the battle is not lost, I believe, in the southern part of the country, primarily in Kherson region, Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk. And the clear sign of that was relative success of Yushchenko in the Kherson region in the last presidential elections. I feel that let me probably I have to finish. I would like to make one more remark regarding the major mistakes by Yushchenko's team. I believe that they made a lot of good things, actually, but they lose a sort of media war, of propagandistic war. Of course, many things are disappointed, but even those things which have been successfully done are not properly presented, and we can talk more about this probably during the discussion. but really, what is the main failure? It's a failure to change, to reform institutions. And in these terms, I'd like to refer to my favorite saga, cartoon saga about American family of Simpsons, which is currently is shown in Ukraine. Well, since last summer, probably, or spring. And it's shown in very good Ukrainian translation, very well Ukrainized, not only in language, but also in some reality. So I would also refer to one reality. There is one fragment, one segment of this saga when Mr. Simpson decided to acquire the gun. And very soon it appeared that the gun brings no use, no help, no advantages to him. But on the contrary, it brings a lot of troubles. So finally, Mr. Simpson decided to get rid of this gun, and his wife, Marge, persuaded him to give up the gun. He agreed, but he couldn't throw away this nice thing. So he asked his wife to do this, and she eagerly agreed. So she picked up the gun and moved to the trash bin, and was about to throw it away. But suddenly she noticed her image in the mirror. And it was very nice with this gun, and she played a little bit with this gun, and then she put it into the bag. So the Ukrainian reference to this story is that Ukrainian Orange authorities inherited Kuchma's state. It was blackmail state, as you know. It was not a state based on the rule of law, but it was a state which functioned, which had rather efficient mechanism of coercion. It was a rather stable state, albeit not legally built, and it's a pity to give up this state. They still try to preserve all the mechanism of this state, albeit they cannot and maybe even don't want. I believe that in the case of Yushchenko, they don't want to use the mechanisms of this blackmail state. And because of this, we have a very strange impression of dysfunctionality of this state, because the old mechanisms do not work anymore. Blackmail in many cases is not employed as under Kuchma, and new mechanisms which are based on the rule of law, on the democratic institutions, are not implemented. Actually, these institutions are not created, and this is a really dramatic development, and I believe this is the main problem we would face, whoever would come to power. At the same time, I would believe that whoever would come to power, Ukraine would be still muddling through, as Alexander Motel wrote probably 10 years ago. This muddling through could be accelerated or slowed down, but nonetheless it's still the same very complicated process. This is too huge country and too divided, so any elite, any coalition that comes in power has to recognize this and to adjust its policy, and it should be very skillful to lead the country. Last but not least, a few days ago I happened to read a couple of interviews in Ukrainska Pravda with young people who participated, who inspired actually, who created images of Orange Revolution. Very young people under 30. And I was impressed by, actually not by what they said, but how they do this, by the very tone, intonation of their voices, by the patience, by dignity, and it gave me very positive impression, because I believe that this generation would bring a much better future for Ukraine.
Before Lucan begins, I just want to say that I, in December, found myself walking out of a minister's office in Kiev, and I won't say which minister it was because of the punchline to follow, but the person who set the meeting up for me turned to me and said, Rabchuk has this typology. You have the communists and you have the Komsomol, but see, the Pionieri are also in power now, too. The floor is yours.
Thanks. So I'm actually going to go a little outside of Ukraine and focus on an actor who's rather important in the former Soviet Union, Russia. And basically, because the reason why I think it's relevant to the discussion of elections is precisely because Russia has made rather overt attempts to manipulate elections. And basically what I want to argue is that nonetheless, there's been a disbalance between the power resources in Russia's hands on one side and its inability to shape domestic politics in Ukraine in ways intended on the other. In other words, you have a sort of a failed imperialism on Russia's side, and I want to talk about that because I think it's important towards understanding Ukraine's future trajectory. Now, the first thing to understand is that obviously Russia, as opposed to Ukraine, has huge advantages in terms of resources and history and whatnot. There's the size, there's the history of vertical control. You know, all these guys, as everyone has mentioned, used to be subordinates to Moscow, right? So one would think, well, it's not that much to revive it. And furthermore, Russia has a lot of leverage with the West. It could probably get away with a lot in Ukraine, given that its energy resources and nukes. And of course, last and certainly not least, it has overwhelming access to energy resources that it sort of lords over Ukraine. And both Belarus and Ukraine are heavily dependent on Russian energy resources. And in fact, Russia has de facto invested tremendous amount of resources in both the Ukraine and Russia. By various measures, it's between $3 and $5 billion a year in subsidies just to Ukraine. That's about 40 to 70 billion overall since the end of the Soviet Union. This is a lot of money. When you compare that to sort of, hundreds of times less has been given by the U.S. and EU combined. So the question I want to ask is, what has this bought Russia, all this investment? And my argument is not much. And that's a puzzle. And, so it has bought some things. They've oftentimes been considered the biggest bully in the room. There's no question about that. But they haven't. And also a lot of individual Russians have gotten quite rich off of things like Rosukonergo, the various machinations and barter deals and whatnot. A lot of individual Russian businessmen have done quite well. But it's not clear what else. People often talk about sort of the domestic advantages that Russia gets from allying with Belarus and whatnot. That may be the case. I'm not sure really how much support for Yeltsin in the 1990s was improved by his alliance with Belarus. I haven't seen any studies, but I'm somewhat skeptical. And it's failed on a number of fronts. It's been unable to get legal control over much of the Ukrainian and Belarusian economy. Putin and Lukashenko hate each other. And even allies such as Yanukovych, who's supposedly pro-Russian, was actually much more resistant in many ways to Russian investment in the eastern Ukrainian economy than Yushchenko was. So it's not clear that there were that many actually economic benefits for Russia as a whole. So as a result, while Russia has been able to sort of be a bully for much of the 1990s, it has not been able to gain legal control over the economy. I mean, certainly when you compare it to the U.S. and Latin America and whatnot, where American businesses have quite a stake, or used to at least. And furthermore, there have been a number of spectacular foreign policy failures. The most obvious is Ukraine in 2004, when Putin made rather crude attempts to influence elections, which turned out quite wrong. They failed to use the gas weapon in Belarus about a year ago, and that was an utter failure. And most recently, of course, in Ukraine, when the attempt to use the gas weapon failed. And finally, we sort of have a pattern throughout the former Soviet Union of pro-Russian candidates running on a pro-Russian platform and then coming to power and being anti-Russian. It's something about, when you're it's one thing to sort of be pro-Russian when you're in the opposition, then you actually get in the position of power and you actually have to negotiate with the Russian government and something seems to happen. I don't know what it is. Voronin in Moldova, he's pro-Russian and then he gets into power and this is a communist. I mean, my God. And now he's as anti-Putin as you could be. And, to a certain extent you see that, in Kuchma in 94. and even to a certain extent in Lukashenko, and now they hate each other. And so the question is, why is Russia, to a very large extent, been a sort of failed imperialist? That's the puzzle. And now to some extent, I think the answer is the fact that, in fact, the resources are not so asymmetric as many assumed earlier. And that's, obviously Russia depends on the pipeline that Ukraine has. And I also think that a lot of it has to do with Russia's declining soft power. I think in the mid-1990s, I've spent a lot of time reading the newspapers of Belarus and Ukraine from the mid-1990s. In the mid-1990s, Russia sort of had this image, had the same image that the EU has in Slovakia as a sort of the answer to all your problems, marital and otherwise, right? Was sort of alliance with Russia. And that's clearly no longer the case. In the mid-1990s, Russia actually was quite successful at influencing events. The 1994 election was one where it's backed Kuchma, and Kuchma won. In the 1996, there was a crisis in Belarus in which Chernomyrdin flew to Minsk and backed Lukashenko, and Lukashenko won. So but as Russia's sort of reputation has gone down steadily since the mid-1990s, and as a result, it's sort of been much more sort of all thumbs imperialist, that we see. But I also want to point to another factor, which I'm actually writing about myself and trying to theorize, is the role of stupidity. And I think that sort of stupidity is a very real factor in regime development, and it's been under theorized. And I think we can actually theorize about it. And basically, I'm defining stupidity as the gap between capacity and outcomes. Right? You have the capacity, but you fail to sort of fulfill your capacity, and it's largely because you're stupid. Okay, and so I just want to sort of, and I think that it's interesting to sort of think about. It's been especially obvious in the past couple of years where, Putin has done a lot of stupid things. And it's just sort of interesting both to point out and to sort of figure out, well, why has he been so stupid? And I think, in most clear, the way he's been stupid is sort of this, he's basically overplayed his hand in places like Russia and Ukraine, and Ukraine and Belarus. It was most obvious in the 2005 election, and 2004 election. And also in the most recent gas crisis where clearly he, in the most recent gas crisis, Putin should have won that PR battle. I'm not talking about the other way, but the PR battle was, Ukraine was not operating by market principles. Russia is heavily subsidizing the Ukrainian economy. It wants to stop subsidizing the Ukrainian economy. After all, Ukraine claims it wants to be independent. It should, pay to be independent. That would seem to be a very easy sell. But somehow Putin screwed it up. I don't know how. And I think there are sort of two reasons why it screws up. The first is that, and it's also, I'm puzzled as to why it screws up, because a lot of people from Russia, they go to Ukraine. So, they know a little bit about Ukraine. It's not like the United States where, we never travel there. They go back and forth. One would assume you go there, you sort of learn something about the place, right? No. Why? It's because they rely on one set of networks. And I just want to tell you a brief story. I have a friend in the sort of mid-level in the Russian government whom I won't name, who's I've known him for a long, long time. And I was in Russia in 2002, and we were talking about the Ukrainian events. And he said, Lucan, I said, I'm really worried. He says, this guy Yushchenko, he's a real fascist, and that he's going to come to power. Yushchenko's a fascist. And I thought to myself, do you really believe that? You can't really believe that. I thought, well, he's just sort of telling me this because that's kind of the line, that's sort of the Russian propaganda line, but he really knows, he's smart enough, he's been to Kiev many times, he knows that Yushchenko's not a fascist. But the more and more, as I look back, I think he actually really believed it. Because he talked to his Russian friends who told him that Yushchenko was a fascist, and he believed it. So they really were, in a sense, they were undermined because they only talked to certain Ukrainians and not others. Whereas foreigners like us who know we're stupid, we talk to everybody and sort of, which ends up being much better. The second reason why I think, source of stupidity is the fact that you have one factor which is quite important, which is that Ukrainians, by and large, have very positive images of Russia. And if they had to choose between the EU and Russia, probably most Ukrainians would choose Russia. If you look at polls, support is much stronger for Russia. So, Pavlovsky and others, they look at these polls and they think, wow, guy, this is good, man. We're going to be able to really capitalize on that. But what they don't get is that while most overwhelming Ukrainians overwhelmingly support Russia, they also overwhelmingly support Ukrainian independence.
And I'm thinking, I was like, it's like, I like my mother. And I'm very supportive of my mother. But if she starts telling me who to date and trying to control my life, forget it. There's no way, right? And so there's a difference between, supporting for Russia, but then allowing Russia to sort of dictate exactly your domestic politics. That's a big difference. They don't get that difference, right? They still think it's one country. So as a result, they're unable to sort of take advantage of this, of both there's kind of soft power that they still have, which is, overall warm, fuzzy feelings on the part of Ukrainians towards Russians, and there's sort of overwhelming economic power. And I think, and this is one case where I have to say where stupidity is we're all quite thankful for stupidity, because if Putin was able to really play his hand as well as he should, I think we'd be in much worse shape. So I think we have to sort of, competence is not always a good thing. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so that's about stupidity. I just want to finally make a very brief comment, sort of on a totally different tack, just about sort of the, assessing the Orange Revolution. I think this is sort of an appropriate time as we get to the election. And most of the discussion, the exception of Adrian, has been quite negative. Things have not worked out the way they expected. And I think I'm much more of an optimist. I'm much more happy, partially because I was always pessimistic. We knew from the very beginning. You can read what I wrote right after the Orange Revolution. They were all Kuchma's guys who came to power, the main leadership. So what do you expect, right? And of course they didn't reform. They're all part of the old guy, and they're all part of the old team. I mean, in some ways, it's sort of a big duh. Of course, they're not going to do major reform. But what's good is that this is a democracy. Which is already pretty good. I'm not sure how stable or how long term that democracy is, but there's a democracy. And I think part of it also is sort of, it's sort of having a very realistic assessment of what the sort of plausible alternatives are. Before we sort of a lot of whether you're an optimist or a pessimist depends on what you think is the plausible alternative. And I think I've been reading a lot about Georgia, and that's another alternative, right? In the Georgian case was very different. Saakashvili came to power with about 97% of the vote, and there's not a democracy in Georgia, largely because Saakashvili has strengthened the presidency, has done a lot of things that many Ukrainians would want Yushchenko to do, which is put a lot of people in jail. That's what Saakashvili's done. I'm not so sure that's really a good thing, because he basically, it's hard to imagine. I have a difficult time imagining that if a president in Ukraine, given the weakness of the rule of law, started putting people in jail, they would resist the temptation to start with the political enemies. They would use this in the way that Kuchma used it. And so in some ways, none of us are very happy about the ways in which people like Medvedchuk are still walking the earth and not in jail. That's much better, in my view, than sort of political purges, which would just sort of lead to what you have in Georgia, which is the failed Rose Revolution. So I want to end on that. Thank you.
I had been worried that the speakers had toned down their remarks, and so I'm glad Lucan managed to stir things up. I think since we have a half hour, I'm going to see first if there are any questions or reactions. Misha Troitsky.
Thank you very much. I just have a very simple, I've got a lot of questions, but I would probably limit myself to just one. Could I ask the three panelists to comment on Mykola Rabchuk's statement about the lack of westernized ideology in eastern Ukraine, and the lack of political culture in eastern Ukraine, which lies basically to the east of that Rzeczpospolita border, and which obviously used to be under the Moscow rule all of the time. So how do you think this lack of political culture manifests itself in eastern Ukraine? Is it just that people are easily manipulated, their political choices are easily manipulated, or they simply do not understand how their economic interests translate into political action, or they are simply there's simply too much apathy, or whether you disagree with that statement? Thank you.
Why don't we we start with Taras, and then we'll go to Adrian, and we'll end with you.
Well, first of all, I think it's a good question because we've heard from and it's always worse in a big panel like this going first because everybody has the ability then to comment on the first speaker. But I mean, we heard from the panelists that on the one hand, Mykola Rabchuk says that this is a third group of Sovietophiles, and then we have Adrian, who I was under the impression is the president of the Orange Circle, not the Blue Circle, saying that the regions of Ukraine as a liberal program. So we have two very contrasting views. I think probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. I mean, there's no question that the regions of Ukraine has attracted a huge number of ex-communists. I mean, that's why the Communist Party and Mr. Simonenko did so badly in 2004, and why the communists only have 4 or 5% now. So the regions of Ukraine isn't this liberal party that Adrian talked about. I mean, it is a very big amalgam of all sorts of things, which includes Sovietophile communists, pan-Slavists, from the Communist Party, but also includes big businessmen who, of course, want reforms because they favor their own businesses. But it also includes a whole number of people who, if Mr. Yushchenko did follow his election program in 2004, would be these bandits who should have gone to prison, like Mr. Kivalov, and Mr. Kluyev. So I think, I wouldn't be as adamant as Mykola Rabchuk to say that this entire group is Sovietophile, because I remember a few years ago I wrote an article about Kuchma's foreign policy then, and I said Kuchma's foreign policy wasn't pro-Ukraine or pro-Russian, it's pro-Kuchma. And I think it's the same with people from the regions of Ukraine. They are not pro-Russian or pro-EU, Adrian. They're pro-Akhmetov. They're pro-Donetsk. That's the limit of they are. So I think it's a mixed picture. It's not glossy liberal, as Adrian says, but I don't think it's either totally Sovietophile as well.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I don't think the difference is between support for democracy or not support for democracy. There have been a million polls of support for democracy in Ukraine. I haven't seen one surveys, very scientific, that shows that Western Ukrainians support democracy more than Eastern Ukrainians. It's about the same. I do think there is a big difference, but I think it's in cynicism. So the division isn't sort of between sort of one ideology versus the other. It's between the cynics and the non-cynics. And the cynics are in the East. And basically, the reason why, as Taras has showed, that they're willing to support Yanukovych even though they think he's a thug and probably a murderer and a rapist, is because they figure everybody's thugs. I don't know about rapists, but they figure better our thug than their thug, right? So if you think everybody's a thug, then you got you have no choice but to vote for thugs. But if you're actually idealistic, which I think people in the West are, then you're much more likely to sort of not accept thugs on your side. So I think that's the main difference.
I'd like to first sort of explain what I was saying. I think, Taras, that what I intended to say and what I believe I did say was that if you look at the platform of the Party of Regions, it could be characterized as a liberal platform. It has no references to the Soviet Union. It has no references to the glorious past. It has no references to the Kuchma-Yanukovych years as years of. It is an attempt to set the markers of a forward-looking ideology or a forward-looking program. It may not be one that these guys govern on, but it is one that they believe they should be promulgating, and I think that is significant.
But that's true of all of the parties in the election.
No, Yulia Tymoshenko is calling for worker participation, profit sharing, and state guaranteed dividends from the private sector. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's an issue that can be debated, but it is not a liberal. It's not a liberal agenda. And I think it's very interesting that these guys are not making workerist promises, and the idea that they're attracting a communist electorate or a post-communist electorate with, at the same time, advancing programs that have none of the echoes of that kind of a past is a rather interesting phenomenon. And here, the point that I would make is that what Mykola Rabchuk can explain his theory, but what I believe is a part of it is that there is a deference to established power. And in the East, there has been the cult of unanimity among the industrial elites, the cult of dominance, a kind of a hierarchical structure with one master that has developed that replicates the Soviet system. But it is now, the new master is a private sector master, and the new master is moving the country in is moving the region and its electorate in a more market-oriented and Europe-oriented direction. In terms of the dynamics of what we expect from Europeanism, none of those characteristics are there. This is not a European Democratic Party in the sense of inclusiveness and openness and debate about political programs and so forth. This is a hierarchical, old party of power. But in terms of the ideas and the directions they are trying to move in a direction, that is incorporating the ideas of the market, that is incorporating the ideas of European integration. The social and civic revolution in the East still has to come, and in that sense, Mykola Ryabchuk is absolutely right. And the social, civic, and values revolution on the part of the people who make up the party has yet to come. But it is very significant and very interesting that this is not a party that has reconfigured old communist and socialist slogans to hang on to its electorate. It is a party that, in the traditional Donetsk and Eastern way, is leading and telling the electorate which way to go rather than responding to the electorate.
Since we're talking about you, maybe.
Okay. First of all, I recognize that any attempt to conceptualize whatsoever leads to simplification. The real picture, of course, is not black and white or orange and blue. And if we use different colors to picture a map of Ukraine, it would look like a rainbow, probably. But on the other hand, still the fact is that some regions of Ukraine developed under absolutely different historical circumstances, different political cultures were embedded there. And this difference could be compared to that of, let's say, northern Italy and southern Italy, with republican tradition in the north and authoritarian tradition in the south. And this difference still is visible. You can easily notice this tradition. The same happened in Ukraine when, Rzeczpospolita, I would remind you that it was a medieval republic with highly developed civic culture, as for that time, with developed court system, with developed system of education, and so on and so on. And while the other political culture developed under auspices of Golden Horde, which was, the opposite political culture. So, of course, the relics, the signs of this tradition could be noticed. And when I call this territory Sovietophile, of course it's not. It's predominantly Sovietophile. It's not 100% Sovietophile. And I don't mean that Sovietophile means a sort of desire to reestablish Soviet Union or to join Russia or so on, but just a sort of Soviet political culture, which. First of all, is marked by high level of paternalism, of vertical rather than horizontal connections between the citizens, actually subjects, not citizens. This is what we still can notice in southern Italy, I believe.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of people. We'll go to Marta, and then we'll go to the last row. And is there a third person who wants the floor? We'll go to Ambassador Pfeiffer. So, Marta, the last row, Ambassador Pfeiffer.
Thank you for wonderful presentations. I'd like to ask two questions, one about process and one about oligarchs and who they're supporting. Lucan, I appreciate your enthusiasm saying, there is a democracy in Ukraine, and what do we expect? They're the same people that were of the old crowd. Taras started by saying this will be the first free, fair election since '94. What grounds do we have to believe that it will be a fair process? As Mykola pointed out, there's been very little institutional change. And the mindset that you were just talking about, large parts of the country are still operating in the same sort of conceptual framework as before. I would very much like to see a free and fair election, but I'm feeling a little less optimistic, so I'd like to hear your commentary on that. And my second question is about the business side, the economics of politics. Adrian, you touched on that, excuse me, a little bit. The party of the regions of Ukraine are very clear where their money is coming from. How much money has shifted over to Yushchenko's side? I had anticipated that more of the oligarchs would move over to support the party of power, and I haven't really seen that happening. And how is that affecting the whole sort of political spectrum, that the oligarchs are still pretty divided and they're putting their money not behind the ruling party, but they're splitting? So how is that affecting this election and their government and all? Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to the gentleman in the back. Yes.
Hold it really close. Okay, thank you. So first question, I think it's to all panelists. We know that Yanukovych is good for Russia and Yushchenko is good for everyone else. And in the case, if Yanukovych becomes a prime minister, would it mean that Russia won the game in the Ukraine's political life? And the second question is about how can Russia influence the elections in Ukraine, or do you think this is impossible? Thank you.
And Ambassador?
About the process. I'm optimistic that the process may be a fairly good one in terms of a free and fair election. The one concern I guess I would have, be interested in comments from the panel, is how do you protect against people, say at the oblast level, who do want to carry out their tradition of helping the boss? So even though you have President Yushchenko saying, no, I want a free and fair election, you may have people outside of Kyiv doing things to help him that then, of course, raise all the sorts of concerns about the fairness of the process that we've seen in the last couple of elections. The second question goes to what happens after the elections, in the sense that I think you've all probably described a situation where you're going to have three parties that will have large status in the new Rada, but no single party on its own is going to be able to form a workable coalition to choose a prime minister and sustain itself. So you've got to have two of those three groups, our Ukraine, the Timoshenko bloc, and the regions come together. What's that negotiating process look like after the elections? And how long does it take to play out? Because you could imagine a scenario where it could be a fairly drawn-out affair. And are there any indications that there are some negotiations going on even now before the elections?
Okay, why don't we quickly take these in batches? The first, the prospect for free and fair elections, including the possibility that regional officials will act more aggressively, perhaps, than national officials. Who wants to respond to that? Go ahead.
First of all, I think that the reason why I'm optimistic is that the legacy of the Kuchma era is that there are a lot of levers for abuse. Doesn't mean you have to use those levers. And for whatever you think of Yushchenko, he does not have an inclination to use those levers. But I think that imagery gives you a very important, is very important because it means that the next person who comes to power might use those levers. And I think that's why I'm not so sure about the long-term viability, although I think two things make me more optimistic. One is the constitutional reform, which it looks like Yushchenko is not going to abrogate, which I think is good because it gives more power to parliament. And I think that's a good thing. Second, I think another thing that I think is good is that the division in the country, which many people think are bad, or also prevent anybody from gaining monopolistic control over the country. Which, again, here the contrast with Georgia is quite striking. It would just be impossible for any politician to get 97% of the vote. That's a really good thing, right? Because it means it's going to be much harder for anybody to gain monopoly control over the country. So, and not all good things go together. It may also mean that we don't have economic reform, but it does mean that we don't have a sort of Kuchma, another sort of Kuchma.
Any other observations on this point?
Well, just very briefly. I mean, I do think that the access of opposition observers to the local election commissions is a much more secure secure process. I think that the state is capable of guaranteeing certainly our Ukraine and Tymoshenko bloc and socialist monitors in the east, and similarly, I think they will guarantee access, as there was access of Yanukovych observers to the election processes in the center and the west. And I think that is a very important point of control. The media are open to, are going to be reporting real time the statements of observers and so forth. And I think that, you know, when you have people like Viktor Pinchuk, a great media mogul that he now is, no longer a steel mogul, saying that the media are free of political pressures, not to speak of political censorship, that I think is equally a guarantor. And also the fact that, you know, in general, just months after a major revolution over voter fraud, I think there would be very few officials on either side that would want to test the public's will in something like this, you know, 12, 14, 15, 16 months after the Orange Revolution.
Let's go quickly to the second question, which is about money moving to Yushchenko.
On that first one, just quickly.
Okay, and if you answer the second one, too.
Oh, about the
money moving to Yushchenko.
Okay.
What has it happened or not?
Well, I think that I go back to my point that previously in parliamentary elections, the biggest amount of abuse of state administrative resources was always in the majoritarian half of the elections, which no longer exists. And I think that removal of that factor, I think, will improve the fairness of the elections. I'm not saying it's going to be 100% fair, very free and fair, but I think it'll be sufficient enough for the OSCE to declare it that, which will be a big deal for the CIS. Of course, there's always an inverse relationship between what the OSCE says and what the CIS election monitoring mission says. So if the OSCE says it's free and fair, they'll probably say it's not. But they might have a bit of a problem if regions of Ukraine comes first. But I would kind of disagree with Adrian, just as I always tend to do, on the issue of why is it, Adrian, that officials will be scared now to not undertake election fraud? Not a single senior official from the Kuchma period, the bandits to prison, remember, has been put in prison. Why should they be scared? I mean, the only people who have been imprisoned have been, like in the Kuchma era, lower and medium-ranking officials. As in the Kuchma era, the senior people have got off scot-free. And the bandits to prison is going to be converted to bandits to parliament, because all those people are on the regions of Ukraine list. And it's too late, Adrian, now to talk about regions of Ukraine purging them. Why will regions of Ukraine purge their list of these bandits 2 months before the elections? They're going to get to parliament and they're going to get immunity. So I think it's wrong. And only yesterday, our Ukraine issued a statement saying that in regions of Ukraine dominated areas of like Donetsk, there is still that abuse of state administrative resources. There's been no clean out. So it's a contradictory picture.
Okay, I want to move this along because we are getting short on time. Does anybody want to say anything about money?
Well, yeah, I'd like to say that I think that one of the important phenomena is that precisely that they are not with the party of power. I think that is a remarkable achievement, that you have the type of government that is not pressuring and cajoling and threatening people to build its coffers. I think the money is relatively well distributed. I think that there is, you know, our Ukraine, the Tymoshenko bloc, the Socialist Party, and the regions all have very substantial resources to conduct an electoral campaign. The media are transparent and open to debate and contestation. So it seems to me that on all those accounts, the differentiation is great. And I also think that a lot of the oligarchs and that were more sympathetic to Yushchenko tend to be those that prefer not to be beholden to one political bloc, but would prefer in kind of a Western fashion to have relationships with a range of political actors. And if it's going to be a coalition government, I think those guys, like the Industrial Union Group, are smarter for criticizing the government when they disagree with its policies, supporting the government when they agree with its policies, rather than having, you know, a uniform and concrete pact with one particular party, movement, or politician.
I want to move to the Russia question. How can Russia influence the situation in Ukraine? Is a Yanukovych victory a Russian victory? And I also I want to make an observation. I sense a heightened rhetoric among Russians I talk to about Ukraine and among people who care about Ukraine, about Russia. And is it unreasonable to expect Russia to want to influence its neighbor? Is it unreasonable to expect Ukraine to want to be recognized in every sense as an independent country and not have somebody standing around at reception saying, well, this is just a bad mistake, which we've heard many Russians do even here. I mean, I don't know what any of that kind of rhetoric is advancing, and it seems to be building up on both sides, which gives me, as somebody who's trying to run a program that operates in both countries, a little pause, because we seem to be heading for a very bad place. So how can Russia influence the elections? And part of that, what do you see as Russia's legitimate interests, if any, in Ukraine? Who wants to start? Taras?
I mean, there were two parts to this question, and the second part is this: can Russia influence the elections? I would tend to agree with Lucan here that I think Russia's, and there's been very good studies on this. I mentioned to Lucan before about going back 2001 by a Norwegian scholar, Tor Buchwald, who already then said that the major problem Russia's always had is that without recognizing Ukraine as a separate country, it can't formulate a policy to Ukraine. I mean, that's it has to recognize Ukrainians as a separate state and separate ethnic group, first of all. And if that's true, I think it's even true now. Doesn't mean to say it can't influence it to some degree, but I don't think it can influence it to the degree maybe it thinks it can. My own conclusion about that is that Russians think they know a lot about Ukraine, but in reality they know very little. And so you have a real problem of national identity issues, I think, here. On the issue of on the pro-Russian, if Yanukovych was a prime minister pro-Russian, or indeed, as Adrian talked about, whether regions of Ukraine is a pro-Russian force, I think obviously it depends on how you define pro-Russian. And these oligarchs, businessmen and centrists are first of all pro themselves, then pro-Ukraine, and then pro a foreign orientation. But let's not take this too far. Yes, it's a positive development that they are now looking westwards, Industrial Union Donbass, Rakhmetov, Pinchuk. Pinchuk, you can go to his website. He has a website called Yes, Yalta European Strategy. This is funded by Pinchuk. So there's no question. And there's in London and Brussels just been formed a European Union European Union Ukrainian Business Council with the support of many large Ukrainian businesses. But the issue is that the EU is not interested in Ukraine. I mean, that's reality. After the next entrants go into the EU, Romania and Bulgaria, in 2 years' time, France, for one, will boycott any further enlargement of the EU. So, Ukrainians might want to go to the EU, but the EU doesn't necessarily at the moment want Ukraine. Big issue coming up, and this is what individuals like Ambassador Pfeiffer have been looking at, is the issue of NATO. And on that issue, these oligarchs and regions of Ukraine are very anti-NATO, at the moment at least. So, I mean, after the Ukrainian elections, there's a potential chance of Ukraine being offered a membership action plan by NATO, not an association agreement by the EU. Now, for that to be actually possible to implement, and for Ukraine to possibly go down the road of NATO membership, based on the figures I outlined as potential breakdown of the next parliament, it means that, in effect, Ukraine could not have a chance really of joining NATO in the next 5 years, the next parliament, without actually regions of Ukraine changing its position on NATO membership. That's the reality on the ground. That would give 3/4 of parliament supporting NATO as opposed to only maybe 50%. And remember that the issue of NATO membership, just as constitutional reform, divides the orange camp. The socialists would be very against NATO membership, and they are maybe crucial to this orange coalition. So I think we have to be very careful. And on the issue of WTO as well, regions of Ukraine supports it, but they, like on many issues, would like Ukraine to join with Russia.
Okay. Lucan, do you want to respond?
Very briefly. I think Russia will certainly influence Ukraine, just not always in the way it wants to. So I think, and I think the issue here is that, again, the sort of gas events show that, I was reading a piece by Miguel Agnan, whose position I assume probably more or less represents what Putin thinks, which the thinking was that by cutting off the gas,
they would make people think twice about supporting Yushchenko because Yushchenko has harmed relations with Russia. Quite the opposite has happened. You've had increased pro-independence Ukraine, and they're sort of angry at Russia. So they're basically all thumbs imperialists, and I think that's good for all of us.
Well, first of all, I don't think that Russia has or should have any special interest in Ukraine more than anywhere in the United States and so on. Russian influence could be compared to that of Russian political technologies important from Moscow. Long ago, somebody told that they are like a secret weapon. It's not important to use this weapon, but to have it, just for some symbolical meaning, like probably to use like a scarecrow or so. And finally, who could be good for Mr. Putin? I don't think that whoever can be good for Mr. Putin, not only in Ukraine but all over the post-Soviet states, because Russia actually, from my point of view, does not require loyal rulers in the neighboring countries. It requires completely obedient subjects, and even Voronin, even Lukashenko do not fit this demand. So I wonder if anybody in Ukraine could be suitable. That's problem not of Ukraine, but problem of Russia.
I do want to say that while Russia cannot decisively influence the electoral choices, certainly not in this election cycle, and I would argue in the long term of the Ukrainian electorate, they can influence economic development. They can influence and create instability by politicizing energy policy. The one virtue of paying market prices is that you can only move to market prices once, and then you just pay them, and your economy adjusts, and it has a bit of a shock to adjust, but then it adjusts. On the other hand, what we have to fear is that Russia is not only a supplier of energy to Ukraine, but it is also the only transiting country for gas from Central Asia. And I think that was the crucial problem and lesson from the energy crisis, that not only does Ukraine control Russia's flow to Europe, but it's a weapon that Ukraine really cannot fundamentally use, but Russia can and did threaten to cut off Central Asian gas unless it went as part of a global solution, which is actually a violation of all sorts of international treaties that Russia is not party to, including the European Charter on energy. So Russia may not be able to do anything but to decide to destabilize and to lead these governments as an example that the path of democracy and color revolutions leads to economic decline and failure, as a means of averting similar trends within Russia's own borders.
We're almost out of time, so I'm going to apologize to people in the audience, but I am going to ask the panelists to make a final comment with an eye towards the question about what happens after the election. So maybe, why don't we just go in the order we just went?
I think it's really, really impossible. I mean, I would tend to agree with Lucan that constitutional reform, because presidential systems have been so bad for democracy in the CIS, constitutional reform moving Ukraine towards a more parliamentary presidential system is good in the medium to long term, but I think we are going to see, in some ways, maybe some chaotic instability after the elections, and it really will test the political maturity of the different groups, particularly members of the Orange Camp, whether they can come up together into some kind of renewed coalition. If they don't, then we'll have Kuchma Light, Yanukovych and Yushchenko.
I tend to think that we're going to have a lot of chaos, but a fair amount of pluralism.
Pluralism by default.
Exactly.
I believe that any coalition between the three major groups is possible, but probably position of our Ukraine is preferable because they have a trump card. President is on their side.
I would say that we've gone through many societies that have had unstable governing coalitions and yet have preserved economic progress and economic growth. We can think of the post-war Italian governments, which were highly unstable for the same reason that an orange coalition government might be unstable, that there was a bloc that would get 30 or 35% that could not participate in the government because it was objectionable to the majority of society. And so you had very weak fractured coalitions, but you had continuity at the level of the deputy ministers and the people who sort of make the system work on a day-to-day basis. I would say the one thing in terms of the calendar, the Parliament only meets in the middle of May. I think then they have to first structure some kind of a political majority within the Parliament, and only then do they bargain on propose some kind of a governmental arrangement. So we may be talking about the current interim government lasting, or the current government lasting until the beginning of July.
Well, I apologize to people I'm not going to give the floor to because time really has run out, but I'd like to thank the panelists for what is a lively discussion, and we have 2 more months left, so who knows what's going to happen in the next 2 months. And I especially want to thank Nicola for making the big trip. So thank you all.
I love your Simpsons. That was great. Yes. I'll have to use that. That's a really great story. I think it absolutely captures the dilemma.
So you're going to theorize stupidity.
Yeah. I mean, that you can actually predict it.
I know.
I mean, it's not a purely random thing. It's not just sort of a function of individual characteristics, but it's sort of systemic.
Nicole, I have a Simpson story I can add to it.
Oh, so this is
a Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian. Each of them. So the Russian sits down on a seat with a nail sticking out. It hurts. He pulls the nail out, sells it, gets drunk. The Ukrainian sits on the seat with a nail in, pulls it out, może продасться, he hides it for a future occasion. It might come in handy. The Belarusian sits on the nail. It's uncomfortable, but he carries on sitting. Is that the Eastern Slavs?
Yes, exactly. Indeed.
Very nice to see you.
Yeah. So congratulations.
Thanks. I'm really excited.
So,
it's a great.
Oh my God!
You want to be in the college?
It's really my dream. So.
It's a great thing. It does. I think for most Americans, it sort of like
Я починаю викладати в
Hi.
What are the characterizations and descriptions of the
All right.
candidates and parties in comparison?
Але я викладаю
The elections is what the Ukrainian people were thinking. But I would like to have...
Nice to see you. Thanks, great. Oh, thanks.
In part because I think you're exactly
No, I mean,
Right, it's like...
Look at lighthouses now, I mean...
And it's like, we can't do it.
Yeah, I was talking to folks from
Yeah.
and I said, if you look at this, and you go back and you look at things like what the Russians were saying after
Right.
what everybody saw as
Control.
They really believe that. Right.
so consistently, you got to forget.
Which one?
Yeah, I think they actually do. That's the thing. I mean, that's the scary part, right?
Yeah, in a way it's almost you give bad points. I almost want to have on the language because you've got such a confused thing.
Yeah, different. Well,
I think so. Yeah, there's one person that probably understands what
Right.
So.
I mean, right. I mean, it is quite amazing. They also don't learn from their mistakes, which is also quite
They
impressive.
did show a little bit of learning curve, I thought, on the gas dispute. It only took them about 2 days to figure out the
I'm not sure actually.
Yeah.
which is,
Well, I guess when their material interests so suddenly sort of hit them in the face, then right.
Whereas in the past,
Adrian more so would have
That's true.
taken a
That's
more
true.
orange.
But it was very similar to 90,
One of the
94.
orange parties or some.
So it's just sort of.
What I would like to do is
So what do you have to do these days? Yeah.
more about more about what the prizes are, what the prizes are, than the statistics about what polls show. It's interesting.
Well, but I think when this was the panel,
Interagency among bureaucracy.
Yeah, well, the idea is basically
election, what we like to see. I think what's clear now is that
you've got to bring all the, it can't be performance, you've got to put together.
Right.
So how do you actually work? It's just my own experience.